let's talk about some multi-platform. So my name is Russell Wolf. I'm the developer of Multiplatform Settings, and I'm going to tell you a bit of a story about where the library came from, stories of the early development, and where it's going, and hopefully get everyone inspired to make some libraries of their own. So, what is multi-platform settings? It's essentially a common key value storage API so that in your multi-platform code, you can persist simple data. Sorry, I'm just missing one little thing on here. There we go. So you can persist simple data and from your common code rather than your platform code. And it works by delegating to platform-specific implementations so that it can interop with your platform code in a natural way. And one of the neat things about it is it's literally in your pocket. So it's used in a number of production Kotlin multi-platform apps, including the Kotlin Conf app. So if you have the app installed, you have this library on your phone. You'd think that settings library would be simple. Like it's just set value, get value, list keys. But there ends up being like a surprising amount of little complexity that can arise when you're maintaining something like this over a number of years. So let's talk about where it all came from. And I like to reminisce a little bit. I've been doing multi-platform development since pretty much day one. And it's always fun for me to kind of look back on where it all started. And this story starts with the introduction of Kotlin. So in February 2016, Kotlin reached 1.0. This was right around, so I'd been doing Android development as a hobby for a number of years, but I just started my first professional development job. And I started playing with Kotlin for side projects and started falling in love with it. A year into that job, I was actually, my main role was doing native Android, but I happened to be doing a React Native project and found it very, very frustrating. But it got me thinking about what would I like in a cross-platform framework. And around the same time, the first Kotlin native tech preview came out. And in the blog post announcing it, JetBrains talked about their philosophy around multi-platform development, the idea of having, not just having JVM code that runs everywhere, which is a complicated problem, but having a common language that interops with each individual platform that it runs on. So I built my first ever Kotlin native code a couple months after this. They had this Tetris sample. It was actually like a pretty full-fledged working Tetris game in the Kotlin native samples repo. And just getting that running on an iPhone was pretty neat to see. And you had to actually get it running on an iPhone. You couldn't use the simulator yet in these early days. So over the next year or so, kind of getting into late 2017, early 2018, I was kind of watching the early development of things, kind of seeing the beginnings of the multi-platform community start to develop. And people like Kevin Galligan of TouchLab were talking about how there's this brand new ecosystem that's about to arise that's going to need libraries. And he made this point that in a fresh ecosystem, it's so much easier to make an impact than in a mature ecosystem. And that got me inspired to try out library development. It got me kind of thinking about that. So February 2018, for the past year, Kotlin Native had been kind of its own little thing, developed separately from Kotlin. And it was still separate here, but in version 0.6, it finally got multi-platform support. So Kotlin Native wasn't just its own platform, it was a platform that could talk to everything else. And I took we had this starter template app at the agency that I was working at the time, and I took that template and converted it to KMP. It was just a simple little app with 2 screens. It makes a web call. It stores some data in preferences. And one of the things that kind of nagged me as I was building that was there was some duplicated code around the preferences. We had this kind of preferences manager that listed some keys. It talked to shared preferences on Android. I had to kind of create a copy of it that talked to user defaults on iOS. Why couldn't that be some shared API? A couple months later, the next version of Kotlin Native, the big ticket item around it was the freeze APIs, which you might remember if you've been doing Kotlin Native in the early days. One detail that was not even mentioned in that blog post was a detail about the ability to use klibs as Maven artifacts. So this is the thing that lets you publish a library and have it be consumed remotely. So the doors were open now to create libraries in this space. And a month or so later, I did. So I kind of committed the first bits of multi-platform settings in that April. The early kind of ideating work I was doing, I kind of squashed everything into one commit. So I no longer have kind of the history of exactly how the early bits came together. But what that first commit has is the bare bones of the API, a sample app that can talk to it, and a test suite. And the second commit was fix missing imports. So apparently when I was watching things, I didn't do it quite right. So from there, I kind of got the code working initially. There was still some work to figure out how to make everything publishable and stuff. We're at this kind of baby ecosystem where there's very few samples of anything that exists yet. There were a couple of apps that different JetBrains people had shown. There were 1 or 2 that showed how to consume a library locally, so like having a module dependency. There was 1 that showed how to do a remote dependency. Like if you go back to this time in 2018, it's funny to think about. Coroutines was still experimental at this point. Like there was no, it was still the Kotlin.coroutines.experimental package. Ktor was server only. The client hadn't been released yet. Like everything was in this kind of like very new early state. The only way to get publishing to work was this fork that some JetBrains developers had made of the Bintray Gradle plugin that would let you publish to Bintray or JCenter. And that was what a lot of the JetBrains stuff would use in the early kind of year or 2. And that was kind of what I ended up using, what some of the rest of the community was using. Like there was no built-in configuration for running iOS tests yet. You had to either write this Gradle task to call the iOS simulator manually, or just run them on macOS. Like none of these were there yet. But over the next couple months and couple years, or over the next couple months in particular, things moved quickly. So the multi-platform Ktor client appeared. Multi-platform coroutines appeared. SQLite, a multi-platform SQL database library. So we started to see kind of like the key pieces of the ecosystem start to appear. There was no version compatibility for anything. So every time a new version came out, everybody had to update all their libraries, and then you have to do things that depended on them. The IDE support was all complicated, where a new version would come out and all your code was read. There was a brief period of time, there was basically a 2-month period where there were 3 different Gradle plugins that you were supposed to use. It kept kind of changing as the JetBrains developers were iterating so quickly to bring all this stuff together. And yeah, there were no kind of good docs. Everything was just kind of samples and scattered Slack conversations, asking people questions. But over time, things started to stabilize. We started to kind of figure out how to get things to work. So what did all this kind of look like for multi-platform settings in particular? And we'll go kind of roughly chronologically through as I added different APIs and made changes, but with kind of like jumping forward to what things look like now. So the initial API was pretty bare bones. So there was a expect class called settings. It had more methods than this, but I'm just kind of showing one as an example. So it had getters and setters for various different data types. And it had actual implementations on Android using shared preferences, on iOS using user defaults. When like the first thing anyone wants to do when they try out multi-platform for the first time is everything should be expect actual, right? It's the new tool. But it ends up being kind of making things a little bit difficult. It's hard to test code that's using expect classes because you can't substitute out a fake implementation. It gets a lot easier when you just go back to traditional interfaces. So over time, that's kind of what things morphed to. So I turned it into a interface settings that has implementations, shared preferences settings, and user default settings. And this is a bunch of things. Like it makes it easier to sub out a test implementation. It gives you the ability to have different multiple implementations on a platform because expect actual needs to be one-to-one. Yeah, a couple other kind of bits of this API changed over time, but we'll get to some of the details as we go. This initial API also was kind of very close to what shared preferences looks like. Like my experience as an Android developer, I didn't know kind of how the other APIs worked as well. So it has this, you pass it a key and you pass it a default value, and the default value gets returned if that key isn't present. On iOS, when you're using user defaults, normally it will just return 0. It took, you had to make some adjustments to make that fit into existing API. But the shape that I ended up using for it was very Android focused. Later on, I added some getter null alternatives. So that if you don't want to pass that default, you can just get null by default instead. And I started to kind of learn over time, key value store that feels like it would have a simple API. Like there are lots of little details that you might do slightly differently. Some things pass that default parameter. Some things just are nullable. Some things do some arbitrary default. Some things, all your types are strings. So there's still some work to be done always to kind of massage things into a shared API. So this was a Kotlin library. I wanted to make use of cool Kotlin features. So in addition to the base API, there's a couple kind of syntax helpers. There's property delegates, so you could have a property that's backed by your settings store. So when you change this, it would persist that to the settings right away, and when you get it, it would read it from the settings. And there's also operator functions that give you that bracket syntax. And these are mostly unchanged from how they were initially. They're all kind of one-liners. And the last thing that was in there kind of from the very beginning was this factory interface. So the settings implementations have a constructor where you can pass a delegate to it. That's the API that is going to forward things to. But maybe you don't care about configuring that. You just want to give it a name. Both Android and iOS have the ability to just kind of pass the file name for your settings store. And this factory interface gave a way to do that construction while still being a separate interface implementation. The first ever feature request I got for the library, this was in late 2018, was to add update listeners. So rather than just being able to read and write data directly, have something that spits to a callback and tells you what the update is. So I had the initial implementation I had this was fairly clunky. There was a add and remove listener functions on the settings interface. There was this kind of empty interface settings listener that was just there so that you could pass something to the remove function. The listeners were all untyped, and so there was these extra typed extensions that delegated to it. Eventually, it kind of simplified to just having a add listener function that returns a listener object that has deactivate function on it. So you have a kind of more ergonomic way to turn things off without just kind of like holding on to this useless object. Another thing that changed over time was as I added more implementations than just the Android and iOS ones, not everything had an observability API. So observable settings was kind of split out as a separate interface. Speaking of new platforms, towards the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, I started adding more. So like my initial focus was all mobile-based, but there's other platforms that Kotlin can write to too. So the first big one was for JavaScript using local storage. And this, like once again, has funny little things that are kind of different from what Android and iOS looked like. It doesn't have the ability to have named setting stores. Instead, there's really just kind of one that you use. There's really two. There's local storage and session storage, but local storage is the only one that persists between visits to your website. It's also everything is strings, so you have to kind of coerce that into the types that you want. And yeah, it's not observable, and so that inspired the split between settings and observable settings. Now there's a number of other, I won't go through each individual one, but there's a number of other implementations that also exist on different platforms. So there's Android, there's iOS, there's JavaScript, there's multiple desktop JVM implementations, there's a native Windows, there's the iOS keychain, and there's a map-based interface that you can use as a test mock. So that if you want to have something that's just in memory for your unit tests, you can do that. So also around this time, I started to get my first external contributions. And this was my first time doing a public open source project like this. It's a kind of funny experience when you get your first pull request from someone you've never met before. And you have to kind of do this dance of like, I want to give them some feedback. I don't want to be too harsh. But I do want to tell them to do certain things. Yeah, I mean, you figure it out, you get through it. I later learned, actually, in this particular case, this was his first open source contribution as well, which is kind of funny. But what it was the delegates, initially, you were forced to manually pass what he wanted to save to. His change let it read that directly from the property name. So you can simplify what your code looked like. I had a couple other early pull requests. Someone pointed out that the initial JVM implementation I had didn't actually persist. So I had a contribution to fix that. That was kind of embarrassing. But the discussion around that actually led to adding another JVM API. So initially it was just using the properties API, which is kind of the .properties files that you might be used to seeing. It just kind of serializes to that. There's also a preferences API in JVM that's pretty similar to Android's shared preferences. So both of those exist now in the library. And the Windows implementation initially came from an external contribution. And this was one where the initial pull request was just kind of a work in progress saying, like, here's a proof of concept of how it works for one data type, but it's not implementing the whole interface yet. Over time, I was hoping he'd be able to kind of come back and finish it, but he ended up kind of getting busy with other stuff. So there's this kind of funny push and pull that you have to learn as a maintainer of, you want to encourage contribution, but is there a point where you end up just finishing yourself if it's not kind of happening on its own, which is what I ended up doing here. For the first kind of year and a half, I was always just kind of testing everything manually, which is terrible. But eventually got CI set up, initially using Azure pipelines. So this was kind of early days of GitHub Actions. People were starting to use it yet, but some people in the Kotlin community had been using pipelines, so I went for that first. I've since moved everything over to Actions, which is kind of feels better just because it's where a lot more of the community is. But I still miss one thing about Azure, which is it had this really nice test view where it would summarize like all of your pass and fail tests for a CI run. And I haven't found a thing that replaces that in Actions yet. One of the first kind of major, so I added a separate module that has this no arg function. So you can just call settings like it's a constructor. And I have kind of mixed feelings about this. Like it's still in the library, I still support it. And it's a lot of people find it really nice as a way to kind of start things off. But it has some frustrations. Like it's very hard to evolve this API without breaking compatibility. So if I wanted to change the default backing API that this is using, it wouldn't be backwards compatible to people who were using it previously. So I kind of see this as it's a way to kind of try things out and get started. But I don't I don't want to make it configurable at all. Like if you want different defaults, you can define your own module that does something similar. So as the ecosystem started to stabilize, I'd initially tried very hard to keep everything in the library free of dependencies. Because in the early Kotlin native days, anything you depended on is something that you have to wait to update before you can update. But as the library ecosystem started to stabilize, it started to feel worth adding maybe some integrations to some common libraries, such as some of the Kotlin X libraries. The most obvious one is to add a coroutines integration so that you can, if you have something that's observable, you can read your values as flows. And at first, this seemed like it would be this nice, like simple, easy module, easiest thing in the world. And this API is fine. Like this works great. But then this happened. The Android team announced a new preferences API called Jetpack DataStore. So not only was shared preferences kind of becoming less the preferred default, but this API is completely flow-based. So all of the existing settings interface doesn't even work that well with it. So how could I find a way to massage the existing settings API into something that would work with this library? And what I ended up doing was adding a couple more interfaces. So there's a suspend settings and a flow settings where that just kind of wrap the same API in suspend functions or in flows. This is a little bit kludgy, and I don't always love it, but it gives us the shared API that we need so that we can have DataStore on one platform and user defaults on the other and still kind of write a shared interface around them. So right now, the only actual implementation of any of these interfaces is either DataStore or there's kind of converters to turn your settings or observable settings into one of the coroutine-based ones. But if you're using DataStore on some platforms and you want to use a different API on others, it gives you that ability. In addition to coroutines, I added some integrations with Kotlin serialization so that you could serialize more complex types to your settings store. So something that you see sometimes with like traditional Android apps is they'll take some complicated object, they'll serialize it to JSON, and they'll save that string as like a single key in their settings store. What my integration actually does is a little bit different. It breaks down the object and saves each key individually. So you keep the structure of it visible, and you avoid problems where the string gets too long, for example. So it ends up being like there's a lot of code kind of underneath this that I'm not showing. But what it lets you do is you can have this one in-code value call that's for this user class. That's the same thing as kind of saving each of these keys individually. This is fun to build, and it's kind of neat. I don't really know how useful it is. I know some people have used it and tried it out. Also, it has a lot of subtle bugs. Like the biggest collection of regression tests in the library right now is bugs that have come up in this module. I just had a new one actually reported a couple weeks ago that I still need to do a new release for the fix. I'm definitely curious to kind of hear feedback from people who've tried it out if it seems to be useful to you. One thing that's a little difficult about it is the settings API is not transactional because most of the backing APIs are not transactional, which means you can potentially have data inconsistencies here where some of these keys save correctly and some of them don't. And the library doesn't really have a way to unroll that. But if that consistency isn't that important to you, you're just kind of using it for maybe like your login user cache or something, but you'll refetch that data, then it can be helpful for you. Time continues to go by. Like we get into 2020, 2021. People start talking about Kotlin Multiplatform Mobile, which was a thing for a little while. And the ecosystem starts to feel like it's stabilizing. So maybe it's time to put a 1.0 of this out. So I did a couple more pre-releases. I did an alpha and then an RC. I don't know why I skipped beta looking back. I think I was just kind of ready to get closer to a release. There was a bunch of breaking changes, like little breaking changes that I did to kind of clean up little bits of the API that had been nagging at me. All of the implementations had initially been named just as a platform, and I changed them to be named by the backing API. I cleared out some stuff that I deprecated over time as I've been transforming the little APIs. And at the beginning of 2023, finally released 1.0. But of course, 1.0 is never the end of the story. Nothing stops at 1.0. So I had various contributions coming since then. There was a contributor we discussed an issue for a little while, and then he put a whole of us together to add a way to convert a non-observable implementation to observable by manually triggering listeners. So you would have, I should have shown a code block for this, but there's a, every time you call set on this interface, it would just kind of manually trigger the listener. So you don't have, if you have multiple instances of it, they won't be able to talk to each other. But if everything is just, you just kind of keep it all singleton, then there's going to be a way to get observability on implementations that don't have it naturally. So it has some caveats, but it's useful to some people. I had a contribution for simplifying some of the serialization APIs, so you don't need to manually pass the serializer class each time. And WebAssembly started to appear. When that target got added to Kotlin, I was able to. So WebAssembly actually has two separate targets. There's a WASM.js and a WASM-WASI, which is essentially kind of browser-based stuff versus server-based stuff. The WASM.js is able to talk to the same local storage API that pure JavaScript is able to do. So I was able to just kind of use that exact same implementation. For WASI, we'll see, but there's kind of no implementation there now. So what comes next? Well, there's still a huge list of open issues. There's always open issues in a library. There's a number of things that, as I've introduced APIs, are marked as experimental, which is a nice way to be able to kind of indicate to users something that might change underneath them, might be a little bit less stable. So stabilizing that stuff is what is a current goal of mine. There's some frustrating bugs that I'd like to clean up. So one particular one, there's a crash that some people are seeing using the keychain implementation on iOS that relates to some accessibility flags that you can pass where by default it only wants to be readable when the device is unlocked, but if you're running something in the background, it'll crash. So this ends up being a complicated issue to fix because the ideal way to do it is to change the default behavior. But if I do that, it will break the data that, like, it won't be backwards compatible with the data that people already have saved. So there's a bit of a kind of deprecation and migration cycle that I'm going to need. But it's kind of the next major thing I'm planning to tackle, hopefully in the next version. A long-time goal has been to add a desktop Linux implementation. That's the only desktop platform that doesn't have anything right now. I have a couple different things that I've prototyped. I'm not a desktop Linux developer myself, and so I don't really have a good sense of what is useful as a backing API for different people. So I'm very interested in kind of feedback if people have opinions about that. I'm probably just going to kind of make an arbitrary decision and pick something to put in sometime in the relatively near future, maybe as a 1.5 version. But I don't have kind of definite plans for that yet. Another thing is adding listener support to the Windows implementation. So right now, the implementation is not observable. There is a API that you can use for observability. It's a little bit complicated to work with. I have a draft that I've kind of played around with this, but it ends up spinning up a lot of threads, and I'd like to kind of clean that up with Threadpool or something. Would also be interested if anyone is interested in contributing here. It would be a nice place. And there's an open WASI proposal for a kind of generalized key value storage interface for that platform. So once that appears, which might be a little while, it'd be nice to kind of get a wrapper around that for Multiplatform Settings. I've also done a little bit of prototyping around a Android NDK implementation, so using the Android native targets. There's currently, that's kind of the last thing other than Linux that doesn't have a implementation currently. And it's not, they're not used as heavily, so it feels a little bit less urgent, but it'd be cool to have just for completeness sake. So other kind of fun things that have happened recently. Multiplatform Settings was a winner of the most recent round of Kotlin Foundation grants, which is something I'm honored by and greatly appreciate. And it's nice to just have some recognition of the impact that this library has had on the community. And I'm always looking for feedback. So it's what are things that you're missing? If you've tried it out, are there implementations that you would find helpful? Are there bugs or pain points that you run into? Feel free to reach out to me on Slack or on GitHub. I will be at the Kotlin Foundation booth tomorrow afternoon from 3:30 to 5. So if you'd like to maybe see some things in action, maybe just talk about the library, give me suggestions. I'm not sure exactly what that'll look like. I have to kind of do some planning there, but I would love to talk to you if you have thoughts. So thanks. Sorry again for the delay, but we made it. So thanks, and don't forget to vote. If you would like to reach out, my GitHub and my Blue Sky are up there in the corner. And you can find the library at that QR code.